Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, here in the saal and out there in the stream. I'm Jannika Gellinek, and I'd like to welcome you very warmly here in the Literaturhaus Berlin tonight. Yesterday, I talked to one of the many huge Rachel Cusk fans who had tried in vain to buy an online ticket. The tickets had been sold out for about 10 days, and I asked him why he hadn't bothered earlier. And he said, well, I did know that she existed as a person, but I would not have believed that you could invite her to Berlin and actually see her on stage. And even though we have hundreds of authors coming to visit here every year, I knew pretty well what he wanted to express. Because not all have this magical ability to not just write good stories, which is difficult enough, but to change your perception of the world. Rachel Cusk, and I guess all in this room know this, is such an author, and so I guess it is easy for admiration to take on life of its own. So he and I yesterday started discussing the essays of Coventry and the way how Rachel Cusk knows how to describe people and families, until it seemed completely implausible to me too that she would be here herself the next day in real life on our stage. But if you have read the online trilogy with the same enthusiasm as I did, you know that you just have to shut up once in a while in order to hear what interesting stories other people have to tell. That's why I will be very brief here, but not without thanking Marie Kaiser, acclaimed radio journalist at Radio 1, who has agreed to host here tonight and has postponed important personal commitments to be able to do so. And Lilian Astrid Gese, who is once again quietly translating simultaneously for us. Outside at the bookstall, you can buy Coventry in English and in German, published at Surkamp Verlag and wonderfully translated by Eva Bonnet. I urgently recommend you to do so. I have no idea who came up with the idea that Friday the 13th is an unlucky day. I guess we all consider ourselves to be very lucky to have you here tonight, Rachel Cusk and Marie Kaiser, and I ask you for a thunderous applause for our guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jannika, and welcome back to Berlin, Rachel Cusk. We are so happy that you're with us tonight and that you're actually here. We all can see you now. And we're going to talk about your writing, your book of essays, Coventry, from which you will also read for us tonight. So welcome to Berlin.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
I start the evening with a quote from you that has remained in my memory. I'm not interested in myself except as an example of things. That's pretty surprising, especially for a writer who has written so much about herself, about becoming a mother, about the divorce from your first husband, and in the current collection of essays, Coventry, also about the broken relationship with your own parents. So how can it be that a writer like you is not interested in herself?
That's a big question. I'll try and give a concise answer. Well, I mean, when I began writing at 23 or however old I was, I think I came to the craft with in a sort of out of a classical tradition, with a classical sense of what that was, of what a novel was. Not even really that much idea of what a contemporary novel was.
You were very young then.
Yeah. And I wrote those novels, and really as sort of time passed and I grew up as a woman, that femininity started to generate, I guess, more and more both difficulties in terms of the actual conditions for writing and content that I couldn't place in my conception of the novel as it was, and there needed to be another form, and that form, again, in a sort of classical definitely the word autofiction, that had never been spoken at this period. The memoir seemed the only available form for that, and I think what I understood was that these inadmissible things that couldn't sort of fit into an imagined representation into a fiction, because, I mean, why couldn't they? Because they were all states of being in which being an individual person, being yourself in the reality of yourself, was inescapable. It couldn't be happening to someone else. The fact that it was, if you're pregnant, the fact that it's happening to you and not happening to the person next to you is all the difference in the world, artistically, philosophically, in every single way. And so I think I realised that in this terrain that was outside literature, and I really was very convinced that it was outside literature, and everything around me reflected that, that your body was your only asset. It was your only terrain, the only legitimate sort of thing that you could write about and write from, and that the minute you strayed out of it, you were in a sense sort of betraying that same material. So, that makes it about me and not about me. It means that because obviously 90% of the things that happened to me in my life I have never written about. It was those things that seemed personal and universal, that could only be represented by means of me owning an identity. Whether even I am the I that's in these essays, it doesn't really matter. It's me saying that I am.
So in your book Coventry, you tackle everyday issues that concern many of us, that are very universal, because you write about what driving has to do with regression, about life with teenagers, the impact of divorce, home decorating, or about being rude. Why are these universal experiences that you wanted to share?
I think because often the essay is different from the memoir, and writing about motherhood, for instance, that felt like almost a force of internal pressure at the difference between internal and external realities that I sort of had to smash myself open and and externalize it, and I mean the essay is a different thing. It's a different kind of conversation, a different kind of communication with the world, and often I'm invited to write an essay, and that's I guess a chance to try and talk to normal people and to sort of see how my ideas about living, about existing, how they look in a much less formal format. A lot of these essays were published in the New York Times Magazine, and so there was this sense of I guess what could I if people have there they are in their lives, and maybe they're not enormous readers even, maybe literature they don't look to literature to reflect their experiences. It was almost a challenge to say what do my ideas look like in this very pitiless sort of huge arena of like a newspaper readership, or so that was kind of how I suppose chose some of the, for instance, about domesticity, seeing that from where I was, which was as a really interesting, I suppose, metaphor for the extent to which the compromises of femininity are voluntary or are self-generated or believed in only by yourself. can that idea translate to someone thinking what they think about their house and their relationship to it, and wondering why they care about it and why it seems to reflect them, and so that was very often what I was, why I was kind of attracted to that material, I guess.
But I guess it's pretty hard to decide what is universal and what is not. How do you check that? Are there some topics that maybe you have discarded because you realized they're not that universal after all?
Yeah, of course. No, I mean, my job is to test that something's true. I might think of saying something, but you know, I really have to test that it's true enough in the world, and if it isn't exactly true for others, that it could be analogous to them or a metaphor for them. You know, I think that you can, by thinking that way, I can't remember who it was who said this, but you know, you can look at the structure of the smallest thing, and if you really thoroughly understand it and are thoroughly honest with yourself, you will know in the correspondence between those two, you know, what is true, and so I think that's been my faith, I guess, in which is a technical faith. I have a complete technical faith in writing.
I once read that Philip Roth once advised a fellow writer, you must write as if your parents were already dead, without consideration. And I was wondering, when you write, do you think about the fact that your parents, your ex-husband, your children might read your text, or do you manage really to just block that completely out?
Well, no, I mean, I don't care about myself, so I don't care about them either. No, I think my rule would be your writing is... in fact, I gave this advice to my stepson the other day. It's a diary, but with the understanding that it will be read. People will read it. So what would your diary look like if you knew that it was
completely different than
going
it does?
to be? Yeah. So it still has to be a diary.
Yeah.
So I think that's been more my...
I don't have the feeling that you write without consideration. I even have the feeling there's a lot of consideration, and it plays an important role, especially when it comes to other people you write about. How important are other people's sensibilities? How important are ethics for you in writing?
Well, it's interesting. I sometimes think, why haven't I cared more about this? And truly, I think, I mean, if a painter paints something or paints somebody, they would not be an artist if they were trying to flatter that person. Everybody understands that. Nobody admires a flattering. They don't want that. They want to see what the person really looks like. And I suppose I always thought, entirely perversely, that people would be pleased that that I was actually seriously taking a look at them and seriously trying to tell the truth about them, take the good photograph. So yeah. Anyway,
it doesn't always.
It's got me so far.
In your essay, "Driving as a Metaphor," which is really brilliant, you bring up an idea that could sustainably improve our everyday lives: the idea of external airbags for SUVs, which are more dangerous for other road users than for the occupants of these cars, obviously. Have car manufacturers already thanked you for this wonderful idea, which could also maybe polish the bad image of SUVs?
Well, I think it's funny, that essay was very curiously understood even by people who I've sort of trusted as sort of intelligent people who read my stuff.
When it comes to driving, people get very emotional.
Well, it's very funny. People took it very literally. Yeah. So I really did get the only other, I mean, anywhere like a strange response I've had was when I wrote A Life's Work, and my own mother wrote to me saying, I read your book about motherhood, and it really did remind me of when I had a baby. which was me. So she, I mean, it was a wonderful moment. I mean, she believed, she understood or believed more in me as a writer than me as her daughter in that moment. So I guess that was a great success. But no, driving, people did write to me and say, oh yes, I feel that when or it really reminded me of driving around Ireland or very, very strange. So nobody understood the metaphor. No one understood.
And you put it in the title, so...
I put a big signpost there. But,
So we're not going to hear this essay, but we are going to hear the essay Making Home. How can the furnishing of a house be interpreted as a deeper narrative of our living together, maybe? We're going to find out. Rachel Cusk is going to read for us an excerpt from Making Home.
A woman once told me about a visit she made with her husband to an oncologist to receive the results of his biopsy. She was perhaps in her late 60s, a grandmother, married for 40-odd years. They were kept waiting for a long time, a tense interlude in which she occupied herself with the question of how she would redesign the waiting room if it had to become their permanent home. She had created domestic spaces for so many years, she said, that such thoughts had become a sort of mental tic, a reflexive action she performed to soothe herself. By the time she had resolved the various problems of insufficient light, wrongly positioned doorways, and an institutional style of decor, the wait was over, and they were called in for their appointment, where thankfully, she said, the news was better than expected. As is often the case when people are honest, these remarks struck me as deeply familiar, while at the same time creating in me a strong desire to disown them. Not long before, I was driven to what appeared to be the brink of mental and physical collapse by embarking on the complete remodelling of our London flat. And while it was true that my children and I were now enjoying the benefits of living in a more pleasant environment, I still felt a certain sense of shame at how determinedly I had brought these events about. I caused walls to be knocked down, and floors to be ripped up, and rooms to be gutted. I threw away decades' worth of clutter and keepsakes and old furniture. With what at times seemed like magic, and at others sheer violence, I caused the past to be obliterated and put something new, something of my choosing, in its place. At home, everywhere I looked, I now seemed to see a hidden part of myself that was publicly exposed. The numberless private decisions I had made, from the colours on the walls to the bathroom taps, were exhibited for all to see. What's more, the very people, my family and friends, for whom this vision was realised, threatened by their presence to defile it. I flinched when they sat on the new sofa, and I darted nervous glances at their shoes strolling imperviously over the unmarked floor. Every scratch and scrape and stain felt as if it were being inflicted directly to my own flesh. I carped at my two adolescent daughters for leaving their possessions strewn over the furniture, and berated them for the evidence they left of themselves in the kitchen. At the time, I felt myself to be serving the reality of my domestic life with them, enhancing it, dignifying it, but now it almost seemed as if what I really wanted all along was to erase it. The old flat had been thickly carpeted in a spongy brown wool that caused me not the merest flicker of identification as it underwent the pummelings of daily life. In the cramped kitchen, whose orange-tiled walls and floor gave it something of the dim atmosphere of a butcher's shop, people had happily sat wedged around the table in the murky light on an assortment of chairs and stools of different heights. We had inhabited the old warren of rooms almost with the carefreeness of children, for in a sense those rooms were not ours, not the product of our will or design. Yet that same feeling of lawlessness seemed almost to create the possibility of getting lost. We were forever searching for one another, calling, wandering from room to room. Sometimes it was hard even to know whether anyone was at home. The thick carpet doggedly absorbed the sounds of life. We were both more and less ourselves in that undistinguished space, less burdened, but less anchored too, freer and yet unreflected, for nothing there gave us back an image of ourselves. When people visited, I felt the need to offer explanations. I would describe what was going to be done to it and what it would look like, as though creating a home out of mere words, and watch their faces brighten as the vision transferred itself from my head to theirs. One day an acquaintance came round, and before I could embark on my tale, he remarked, running his hand fondly over the peeling laminate kitchen counter, on how rare and refreshing it was to be somewhere untransfigured, somewhere of an authentic ugliness that didn't look like a photograph in a magazine or a poor imitation of one. He complimented me on taking this stand against the ubiquity of middle-class tastes. He appeared to view it as an artistic and philosophical position. "Don't ever change it," he said with a small smile. "I'll be disappointed if you do." I think that's enough of that one.
In Making Home, you compare your own painstakingly renovated flat with the cheerful house of a friend of yours, where crumbs crunch underfoot and hamsters are living in the wardrobe. The home is a place that comes up again and again in your books. Why are homes, especially those in which children grow up, so interesting to you?
Well, I think it's not a particularly complicated or sophisticated problem, but it is a problem of femininity. It is a problem of, I guess, female history. And I mean, this question of female history, which I find myself sort of thinking about more and more, is, I suppose, like, I mean, its essence is that it is unexamined, and that the individual woman has to sort of battle against, free herself from the various imprisonments that have traditionally made women unfree, and I think that those shadows fall in kind of interesting places, and the domestic space is definitely one of those. And I mean, you know, I'm aware that talking about children and you know, that for me was 10 plus years ago. And of course, one always thinks that things have improved, and maybe they haven't, but they sort of look like they do.
You recently moved to a new flat, so did you do something different than back then, when you were?
Well, I mean, we moved country and moved language and those things.
You moved to Paris, but you had the opportunity to have a new flat and to, yeah. I
mean, I think that the burdening of those spaces that goes on is okay. It's partly a historical sense of expectation of one's femininity, and you know, I've often heard women talking about that. Even the, and in fact that's what the essay goes on to say a little bit, but even the appearance of carelessness, which people, you know, women envy. They envy the woman who doesn't care if her house is a mess, and it shows that she's, you know, freer than others, and so that even the disorder, the not caring, is a kind of appearance. I think there's also something about writing in all of this, the writer as a domestically trapped person, and the
that's true.
The huge cross current for the woman writer who is also a mother, of this space becoming, you know, a battlefield, really. So, yeah, I guess those are the reasons why it's interesting to me.
I remember one sentence from this essay. It was, "At home, everywhere I looked, I now seemed to see a hidden part of myself that was publicly exposed." For me, it was almost funny to read that from someone who writes so openly about his own inner life, the fear of revealing too much about oneself through the design of one's home. How can you explain that?
I mean, I guess you know, people who try to create things, try to create artistic things, there's a lot of shame that accompanies that. process, but in the end, it's an ultimate control over the way somebody sees things, and it's the opposite of being seen without knowing that you're being looked at. It's an extremely controlled perceptual environment, and if that is what you, and all things are created in much the same way. You create an object or the appearance of something or a stage set, or in much the same way as you create a text.
That's true.
So the idea of being seen without that, not being able to control the ways in which people are seeing things, is
that was the frightening part. In your essay, you remember a prestigious room in your childhood that no one was allowed to use, where the furniture was displayed like in a museum. And I know those rooms from my own childhood, the rooms where nobody was living in, that were merely there to be looked at. And you wrote that you have often preferred working in cramped bedrooms or at kitchen tables, even when you could afford a room, the much wanted room of your own. Do you still need a certain degree of discomfort and chaos to be able to write, or?
No.
Not at all.
Definitely not. No, quite the opposite, probably. But I think that it is true that there's a. I mean, again, this is a question about femininity in spaces, and the image of the writer at his desk, and indeed the kind of history of accounts of how books have been created, the terror that people have lived in around artists, visual artists, as well as writers, men, who must not be disturbed and must not be interrupted. And those things are very different in femininity, and almost the room that is created, the study that is created for you is, I think I say again in somewhere in this essay, that you almost have to be two people you have to be the one who's looking after the room, and then the one who's going to almost go and change costume and go and be in the room and be somebody else. So I think these are kind of deep sources of confusion, and that like for any woman also come from the great difficulty of recognizing anything about your own circumstances in the circumstances even of your own mother when she was your age. So there's very little guidance, I guess.
And your writing situation today, what does it look like?
Well, the interesting thing for me has been moving into a different language. That has been which has caused my brain to fall completely silent for a year, really, a bit more than a year.
So you weren't able to write because you had to learn French, and
it was more than learning French. It was like a huge oil change, like you do for a car, and you completely change all the oil, and so everything drained out, and then had to be. And that's been very interesting because it actually, all of the things that I've been interested in about how art fails around subjectivity and what subjectivity actually is, how it occurs, and how it occurs at a language level, which, I guess the outline trilogy was my attempt to circumvent some of those things, to not write the preformed sentences that everything that I knew about verbal expression were telling me to write. So that's become a really, really fascinating intellectual and personal experience, thinking much more about translation, much more about a situation like this where here I am in Germany talking in English. Most people are appearing to understand it.
Yeah.
So that's made me want to write. That's made me view the currency of language as a very different coin from what I had thought, and to see much more how stained it is with things that you're not even aware of, and you know, this is not true for a visual artist, it's not true for a musician, but it is true for a writer, that language is so enmeshed in, I mean, you know, in bourgeois factors, I guess, more than anything else, but much more than I had thought in the psychological experience of nationality.
You have been called a Brexit refugee. Some newspapers wrote that. Is that a term that you are comfortable with?
I think the word refugee should be reserved for people who truly are. No, we were very lucky to be able to move, but we did walk away from that particular series of events in the UK with a determination to be European, and yeah, that means becoming stupid. I am an 8-year-old child. I'm probably not even 8. I'm 5 in Paris, and I make the most ridiculous errors in life and language, and so that's the price we've paid.
Is it liberating in a certain way, because you're not expected to do perfectly everything?
No.
No, okay.
It's liberating in lots of other ways,
okay.
But in that particular way, somebody was saying, I can't remember who this was, or I read it the other day, speaking in a language not her own, and at the end of this conversation saying to this person, you have no idea how intelligent I am in Spanish. She's a Spanish person. And I think, yeah, I can really relate to that, but it's it does, it concentrates the mind very much in terms of language, and I think I've found that when I am back in control of a sentence, my knowledge now of what it is that I'm in control of is very different.
You once said in an interview, I tried to answer philosophical questions as a civilian. I really liked that expression. What exactly do you mean by that, and why is it important to you not to answer them as a philosopher?
Oh, because I'm not a philosopher.
Yeah, but some people try to answer them, you know, in a very different way. It's very...
Well, I mean, there's the science of philosophy, and then there are the things that are deeply scientific in artistic expression, and I think that I have always had a complete faith that any art can understand any concept, whether that's mathematical, scientific, that you can reach the same conclusions if you understand art to be a technical discipline. And so, I mean, I have never called what I formulate philosophy. That's a word that you know, has started to be used about me, which is kind of flattering in a way, but and in fact I've had a lot of dealings with philosophers in Paris. More fun than it sounds. Who are very who are interested in, I suppose, the sort of moral, human moral issues that I, for whatever reason, am interested in wrestling with and working out. Yeah. So that, I guess, is a feeling of satisfaction that I'm not like wrestling for just on my own for no reason at all.
One of those philosophical questions in the book is definitely the essay on rudeness. You ask yourself whether it is sometimes better to be honest and rude, because rudeness can also serve as a barrier to actions of wrongdoing, which is an interesting thought. You describe rudeness around Brexit. You also talk about your own rudeness towards a shop assistant or towards your children, whom you, like the majority of parents, I think, never showed the same respect as any other adult in some situations. The example of picking children up without asking them is very strong in that way. So you write about your own rudeness, and you make yourself vulnerable in your essays, because you write about your lack of politeness sometimes. How much consideration do you actually give to your own interests when you write? Do you care at all whether readers find you sympathetic or condemn you for your behavior?
No. Not really. I mean, that's not what I'm doing. So, and whether, as I say, whether the things that I write about myself are true or not,
nobody will ever know.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I've been reading Annie Ernaux a lot, like everybody in this moment, but partly because moving to Paris has made me see her in a much sort of closer frame, and you know, it interests me. She very much does this, and
she exposes herself.
And is on the receiving end of an awful lot of aggression and venom. And in fact, I've just written an essay about her, and therefore sort of thought about this even more. I mean, what is the purpose of doing that? You know, I see it better when I'm reading her than I can ever see it about myself, and I think, okay, it's interesting that one of the things I wrote in my essay was that shock says a lot more about the people who feel it than about the one who caused it, and that very often shock is followed by acceptance. That truth is shocking, and she goes through those cycles very frequently, and it's all very well when the thing that she's saying that's shocking is not about, isn't too close to you. And so I wrote an essay about Annie Ernaux for Surkamp a few years ago, where I said that actually what really irritated me about her, there was an area of her honesty that irritated me, and in fact, thinking about it now, I think that's probably because it came too close. You know, I myself was reacting as possibly readers have reacted to my work, and so it's harsh. It's a harsh transaction. But in the end, I do believe the truth teller wins, and that things like dislike. You know, you take that idea of, do you want to be, you know, do you care if people like you? Or you know, if you actually took that idea all the way back to the beginning, which is, I want to write a book that people like, for instance, I mean, you would be involving yourself in a drive to mediocrity, and you know, there's plenty of people who find ways of sheltering. You know, they find nice sheltered spots to create their work, and that don't get in the crossfire of these things. But when you're talking about the kinds of things that I'm talking about, it's pretty much impossible to do. And you know, I can't describe things by means of saying, oh, Jane over there, you know, was said this to this person. You know, it doesn't work. One has to use oneself as that example.
But yeah, you experienced a lot of hostility. You exposed yourself a lot in the text, life's work. You were called a bad mother. Did it leave no mark? There are some things maybe that you do differently now than you did back then? Maybe become a little less radical in terms of honesty?
No, across a big sort of field of years, I see that as a malfunction. I see it in Annie Ernaux too. I wonder what she thinks about, because you have to, as an artist, you have to think people getting angry. Is it them or is it me? Whose fault is this? And so I have thought about that. And in the end, what I've thought is it isn't exactly a malfunction. It's that if you look at any human situation, somebody can be right, and they can really want justice to be done and want truth to be told, and yet some greater act of diplomacy, and often that is silence. It's merely silence that will allow things to take their own course towards what is true and right. And again, writing the trilogy was me very, very much working that out. But it did involve a feeling of abandoning the kind of front line of my right to say that's not right. And it was difficult to do. It's difficult to trust that works. It's a different act of faith, I guess, that is involved.
In the essay on rudeness, you come to the resolution to be more polite in the end. What experiences have you had so far implementing this resolution? Is it working?
Manners are very good. They definitely are. The French are very polite.
Is it easier to be polite in French too?
It's really helpful.
Yeah.
We see as newcomers and foreigners there, I've very much understood the point of manners, that it tells everybody what to do and it tells you what to do. So yes, I'm still in favour.
Well, we now hear an excerpt from an essay about what happens to the family narrative when sweet children turn into wild teenagers. Rachel Cusk will read for us Lions on Leashes.
When my two daughters became teenagers, something happened that was unique in my experience of parenting so far. Other people began to warn me how awful it would be. Until then, the story of family life that I heard from my contemporaries had been one of relentless, almost frantic positivism, a bright picture from which shadows were meticulously absent, as though they had been carefully excised. I had struggled to believe in that story, which often seemed to invoke a version of childhood composed of adult fantasies so powerful that they threatened to undermine reality itself. A Walt Disney World where wish fulfillment had become a moral good, yet whose ultimate desire was to obscure the truth. In my own experience, truth had stubbornly continued to insist on itself. The difficulties of continuing to create while bringing up two small children, the conflict between artistic and familial identity, the attempt to pursue your own truth while still honouring the truth of others, the practical and emotional complexities of motherhood, and recently of divorce and single parenthood. All these tensions were real, so real that sometimes their causes were difficult to locate. At such times I learned to recognise the good by its proximity to the bad, and vice versa. Light and shadow couldn't be separated, for the reason that they defined each other. Yet the public narrative of parenthood denied the light and shadow of reality. It veered insistently, sometimes crazily, towards joy. Sometimes it simply sounded like people trying to bridge the gap, for themselves as much as for others, between the image and the truth, a gap that is nowhere deeper or more mysterious than in the experience of having a child. But at other times it sounded more like something nobler, something I lacked the knowledge of, a kind of courage or self-restraint that was interwoven with the responsibility of parenthood, a form of election, like knighthood, that brought with it a distinct code of conduct. Except that suddenly it didn't anymore. When people asked me how old my daughters were, they would grimace at my reply. "Poor you," they'd say, or "good luck," or at best, Don't worry, it'll pass. You'll get them back eventually. Stories began to emerge in my circle of acquaintance, of shouting and slammed doors and verbal abuse, of academic failure, of secrecy and dishonesty, and of darker things, of eating disorders, self-harm, sexual precocity, and depression. They used to be so sweet, a friend of mine said of his daughter and son, shaking his head. I don't know what's happened. It's like a nightmare. Another friend says, it's as if they hate me. I walk into a room and they wince. I speak and they ball up with irritation. I'm being bullied, she says, reminding me of Raymond Carver's disturbing poem on an old photograph of my son, an outpouring of the author's feelings of victimization at the hands of his adolescent child, his anger at the waste of his own youth and energy the nurture of this petty tyrant represents. Carver was an artist and no cheerleader for family life, but perhaps all parents feel an element of artistry in their creation of a child. To be an artist is to have your creation obey you, but as Carver points out, parenthood is the opposite of art. The created object, the child, can become instead an uncontrollable source of destructiveness. Adolescence, it strikes me, shares some of the generic qualities of divorce. The central shock of divorce lies in its bifurcation of the agreed-upon version of life. There are now two versions, mutually hostile, each of whose narrative aim is to discredit the other. Until adolescence, parents by and large control the family story. The children are the subject of this story, sure enough, the generators of its interest or charm. But they remain, as it were, characters, creatures derived from life, who nonetheless have their being in the author's head. A large part of parental authority is invested in the maintenance and upkeep of this story, its repetition, its continued iterations and adaptations. And it feels right to tell it, for what we are offering our children is a story of life in which they have been given a role. How true is it? It's hard to tell. In a story, there's always someone who owns the truth. What matters is that character's ability to serve it. But it is perhaps unwise to treasure this story too closely or believe in it too much, for at some point the growing child will pick it up and turn it over in his hands, like some dispassionate reviewer composing a cold-hearted analysis of an overhyped novel. The shock of critique is the first faint sign of the coming conflict, though I wonder how much of what we call conflict is in fact our own deserved punishment for telling the story wrong, for twisting it with our own vanity or wishful thinking, for failing to honour the truth. My daughters tell me tales of how this conflict is playing out on the other side, in their world. One friend's mother is so fearful for and overprotective of her daughter, an only child, that she won't let her go by train with a group of her friends for a day out. The daughter must remain at home while the others enjoy themselves. Another friend's parents have no idea that their son is a regular and increasingly chronic drug user. They adhere to the happy, sunlit story of family life, while his friends grow more and more anxious on his behalf. Another is subjected to severe and often bizarre penalties and punishments for the minutest failure to achieve excellence in her moral, academic, and personal life. Her parents are Catholics, my daughter adds, as though that explained everything. Because they're told by my daughters, these stories have the teenagers as their protagonists. The stories told by my peers work the other way round. One woman's son texts her abusive messages from his bedroom while she stands cooking in the kitchen below. Another's children have defected to live with their father, despite their mother's tireless generosity and care, because he allows them unrestricted access to their phones and laptops. The son of a friend has a party at the family home that results in hundreds of pounds worth of damage. Another's daughter won't invite friends home or allow her parents to pick her up from school because she is ashamed of the family's modest house and car. I find that I naturally side with the protagonists in my daughter's stories and against the narrators of my friends. My own memories of adolescence remain the most potent I have. That self is still more real to me than any other I have inhabited. As a 13-year-old, I felt both powerless within and outraged by the adult world. I was characterized as the family firebrand, the difficult one. But increasingly, I find myself recollecting the powerlessness. It is possible, I have discovered, to attribute an inordinate power to your children. But in fact, the only power they have is that which lies in the mere fact of existence. They exist. It is from what their existence means for us that the chimera of their power is generated. I'm currently writing, I wrote this a long time ago, so I'm not writing it anymore. I'm currently writing a version of Euripides' Medea for a theatre in London. The director and I have an ongoing difference of opinion. The play is notorious for its representation of a woman who kills her 2 young children. That is what most people know about it, without necessarily being aware of how or why she does so. At its most reductive, Medea is the archetype of the bad mother. Vaguely, she has become associated with the concept of maternal ambivalence, in which women's supposed hatred for and resentment of their offspring is seen as the counterweight to their enactment of perfect motherhood. There is a kind of cultural hysteria around maternal ambivalence that I dislike, for the reason that it takes something subtle and interesting, the mixed feelings of motherhood, and turns it into something blatant and grotesque. The idea that the woman who explores those feelings sits at one end of a trajectory that has child murder at its other is ridiculous. And besides, Medea doesn't kill her children because she dislikes them or finds them irritating. She kills them because her husband has abandoned both her and them for someone young, beautiful, and rich. She refuses to be made such use of. She refuses to let him get away with it. I find that I do not believe in the child killing as a literal event. But the director cannot conceive of a Medea in which the children are not killed. Around this impasse we have arranged ourselves. I say, ours is a world in which psychological and actual violence have become mutually distinct. The killing no longer means what it once might have. Actual violence is rudimentary and mute. Psychological violence is complex and articulate. He says, the play's violence is both metaphor and reality. The two, in other words, meet and mingle, as in the world of Greek mythology, where gods met and mingled with humans. I say, that metaphor is lost on our literal-minded society. Instead, the play is regarded as a problem play. But the problem of women murdering their children is not a problem we actually have, even as metaphor. In fact, if anything, it's the other way round. Metaphorically or otherwise, women don't murder their children. It's the children who murder their mothers. The director looks sceptical. We discuss the Oresteia, in which 2 children, Electra and Orestes, murder, the former by encouragement and the latter by physical violence, their mother, Clytemnestra. Electra and Orestes aren't, in fact, children. They are teenagers. They hate their mother for the fact that she has disposed of their father. They have come to resent maternal power so much that they destroy it. Instead, they've reverenced the paternal, which is all image. Their father, Agamemnon, was away fighting gloriously in Troy for most of their lives, where their mother is all actuality. They crush and disdain that actual parent in pursuit of the imagistic father whose value is recognized out in the world. Sound familiar, I ask? Do you want me to read the last bit? I think that's enough.
Thank you so much, Rachel Cusk. So you compare teenagers to wild animals who have only temporarily allowed themselves to be tamed and put on a leash. And what I find an interesting thought, you compare adolescence with divorce, because in both cases the family narrative is challenged. It drifts apart into different stories. And I wondered what happens to the family narrative after this phase of puberty and wildness is over. Can it then be possible, maybe, unlike in the case of a divorce, to return to a common narrative, to perhaps return to a common narrative with several narrators?
Well, I'm not an expert in any of these things. I mean, the only thing that interests me in this area of family life is it's again these concerns about subjectivity and how stories, how people control stories, how belief and authority operate in our lives, and to me this little domain of the family is a very good is full of examples of that, and full of examples of I suppose problems of I guess inequality is the word, and power. Power is the greatest problem in our world, and power. You know, most people only really experience power as a parent, and true powerlessness as a child, and so for that reason, it's an interesting dynamic, I guess. But no, I'm very much not a expert on family life.
Yeah, but the narrative, is it totally destroyed afterwards, or do you think it can be refound, the family narrative? There are families that keep their narrative on and on.
Well, I mean, I suppose the thing is that sort of every phase of this journey, for want of a better word, you know, is accounted for, has a history. You know, the loss of one's parents, for instance, which has just happened to me, you're sort of dizzying on dizzying mountaintops at that point, looking down at how I suppose it's really the structural foundations of identity, and it is impossible to pick those apart. It's impossible to sort of separate oneself from formation, essentially. And so the question is how to scrutinize formation, how to scrutinize, you know, the moral problem of forming other people. Again, this question of being seen as something that you don't know yourself to be, which is I suppose the most mysterious and incomprehensible thing. And again, this is another big Annie Ernaux point, that, you know, the difference between individual perception and one's existence as a concrete object that you know, other people are perceiving, and in the end, those two things, you know, cannot be brought together. So, and that space in all of this is you know, that is your space for moral navigation, and yeah, and I guess there's a point at which you realise, and that point for me was my own, just to speak personally, my own child starting to become a writer. And off she's gone to study writing in America, and she's writing things, and I think I could have done so much more in terms of influence. You know, and you think, well, I suppose there's plenty of people who know that and know that this question of formation can be it can be administered crushingly, powerfully. So, yeah.
So your other daughter isn't becoming a writer, so maybe.
Very much not.
Your German readership learns an expression in your book, being sent to Coventry. I hadn't heard that before, which means as much as, I don't know, to be deliberately ignored. Yes. How would you describe it?
It means to be given the silent treatment. It's a collective decision to ignore a person. I don't know why it is called being sent to Coventry.
Is that a common saying, or is it like rather old-fashioned thing to say?
Okay, it might be a little bit dated now, but no, it would still be absolutely understood.
Yeah, because in German we have this expression to ghost someone that we use in German too. Is this the same thing, or is it different from?
No, it's very similar. Yeah,
it's very similar.
Yeah.
And you write in your book that you have heard this phrase from your parents all your life. Certainly not a coincidence that a war generation is raising its own child with the narrative of war. How important is language to you in the personal dealings with people who are dear to you? How much do you pay attention to your words? For example, an expression like send someone to Coventry.
I suppose I don't see that as personal, particularly. I mean, it is. I think not at all is the answer, probably. I mean, it's kind of rare for me to be terribly interested in language as a field of sort of quirks or particular features, and which makes me realise that you know, so much of my early writing, fiction writing, was when I still used, you know, normal characters rather than
those
what
were
I
the
do
times.
now. That you know, so much of it was about listening to the way people spoke, their accents, their that actually that was a language was almost a tool of visual, kind of a visual perception, I suppose. And that I think because I grew up in America and moved to England in childhood, and almost like I have to do now in France, that I'm sort of reading an interface and trying to understand what the things that people say mean about who they are. And I think that's still very, very deeply inside me. I don't know that I would know. I don't know that I would have that language for myself, or that I would want to say anything that would give away anything about who I am, unless I had decided that was what I was going to do.
In this essay, Coventry, you analyze a little bit the power strategies of your own parents, who punish you with weeks of silence until at some point you decide to stay in Coventry, to choose to stay at this place where the worst already happened, as you write. And you compare trying out silence yourself. You compare it with riding a bicycle. So when a writer begins to be interested in silence, it becomes quite interesting, because I guess it influences the writing. What effect did that have on your writing, this interest in silence?
Well, I mean, that's definitely in the work I'm doing now. This question of, and I've also become, I mean, I've always been very interested in drama, and I mean, not particularly the theatre, but the text of the play, because it's every assertion in a drama, in a play, creates a silence around it, and that's not true in a fiction or a prose text, where everything has to be linked to the next thing, and so I think this question of how to create silence is kind of interesting. And my last novel, Second Place, I sort of tried to do that by locating the book in another book, and almost creating a new area of silence where kind of my book would have been, if you see what I mean. So that's, something I'm thinking about a lot.
And you are dealing with another rather neglected topic in the novel The Other Place. In an interview, you called it the post-children phase, period of life that plays a major role also in this novel. What is so interesting about this topic, perhaps also for women who are yet to enter this phase?
Well, I think what I meant in that post-structural femininity, and I think for any human, man, woman, child, adult, you know, that exiting structured phases of life is a sort of vertiginous experience, or that can be experienced as freedom, and equally can be experienced as exile or being lost. And this particular threshold of post-biological and familial life is a very, very significant one, and there's not very much is constructed. On the other side of that, there aren't very many locations on the other side of that, and I guess that's another question of another matter of sort of history and its absence that has interested me.
It's a rather neglected topic, because now when you look into the bookstores, you have so many books about motherhood. Over 20 years, when you published a life's work, it was unheard. So how does that make you feel when you see how many young female writers write about that today?
It depends what they're writing, I guess. I don't read them, so it could all be, it's probably just the wheel is spinning around. Yeah, it very much depends what's being written.
So at the end, we also take a little trip to Coventry and encounter a phenomenon that we are all familiar with, I guess, from restaurant visits, the silent couples we meet there. They only eat, they do not talk. For many people, those couples trigger the thought, oh God, I hope we will never become like that and have nothing more to say to each other. But Rachel Cusk takes a very unusual look at this phenomenon of silence and reads for us once again.
My husband and I have both come from other marriages. At a certain point, our disbelief came crashing down on our heads like the roof of Coventry Cathedral. We live on the coast now, in a village holidaymakers of a certain age like to visit. In the local pub, we watch tourist couples sitting in silence over enormous platters of fish and chips. It is unwise, I have learned, to put one's faith in how things look. But it's not often that silence presents itself as a visual event. And other people, it seems, notice the silent couples too. Like the seal colony out on the Sound, it turns out they're a sort of local feature. The waiters in the pub treat them with a special tenderness. Children gaze at them with what might be wonderment or concern. Our friends discuss them, the men with nervous jocularity, the women with a remote and finely judged pity. Everyone agrees that it is sad. I notice that they are often very well turned out, the woman carefully made up, the man pressed and groomed. They sit erect among the untidy holidaying families with their shoals of tousle-haired children, their dogs, their footballs and frisbees and bicycles, their aura of action and noise as they pass through life like a company of soldiers going over the top. The families are on display. It's part of how they function. Families tend to be conscious of being looked at. They perform themselves as though in expectation of a response, a judgment. I suppose they are exposing what they have created, as an artist feels compelled to do. The exposure ought, in a sense, to correct the subjectivity of parenthood, though it doesn't always seem to work like that. There are families whose children run through the pub shouting and laughing and knocking over chairs. There are families where the children sit miserably at the table with downcast eyes while their parents relentlessly chastise them. "Jacob, you're annoying the lady," says one mother, mildly and with unmistakable pride, while her son fires his water pistol at another child across my table. "Your needs aren't a priority right now," a father is saying at a table on the other side. He is addressing a pallid girl of 6 or 7, with square-framed glasses and hair in tight flaxen plaits tied with ribbons. "You always get your own way," he adds, raising his glass slowly to his lips. The silent couples display themselves too, but theirs is an exposure far more mysterious. They sit like monuments, like commemorations of some opaque history. In their silence and their stillness, time seems almost to come to a halt. They are like effigies of the dead standing among the living, mute and motionless amid the helter-skelter families and the noise and bustle of the pub. They eat slowly, carefully. They don't, as a rule, look at one another. It is as if, each in themselves, they are alone. I wonder why they have come to this public place to enact their silence. They seem to represent failure. Have they come to warn us, like ghosts from purgatory might enjoin us to mend our ways, lest we too get caught on the treadmill of our sins? Or have they come just to warm themselves for a few hours with the conversation of others? It could be supposed that they are unhappy, but I wonder whether this is true. Perhaps what they represent is not the failure of narrative, but its surpassing, not silence, but peace. They are all talked out. This is a notion other people find unsettling. It can be assumed that many of the silent couples have children, now grown up and gone away. What other people don't like, I suppose, is the idea that on the other side of all that effort, all those years of joy and toil and creation, all that suspension of disbelief, there is nothing, or nothing palpable, to look forward to. That one might wake from family life as from a bacchanal into the cold light of day. I wonder whether the silent couples once spent 2/3 or more of their time talking about their children. I wonder whether their silence represents the problem of reconnecting to reality once the story has ended.
Thank you so much, Rachel Cusk, for this evening. Also for the fact that I will definitely see the silent couples with different eyes from now on. And many thanks to all of you. It's going to be possible to sign books later on. And yeah, have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. There's your book.